Welcome to episode 6 of the SCORE podcast. I'm your host, Dave Walker, founder and lead tutor at Walker Prep, which has been helping students achieve exceptional score gains on the ACT and SAT since 2014. To learn about the impressive results we've helped our students achieve and how we can help you, visit us at walkertestprep.com. That's walkertestprep.com. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by SAT and ACT tutor extraordinaire, Rob Schombs. Rob is a co-founder of Brilliant Prep, which offers in-person group classes for SAT, ACT, and AP Prep in Dallas, Texas, and worldwide online. He's also an expert SAT, ACT, and AP tutor with over a decade of one-on-one experience. You can learn more about him and his work at http://rob.school. Today's discussion with Rob is going to be absolutely loaded with incredibly valuable insights into effective test prep. But before jumping into that, I thought I'd share an interesting anecdote about how Rob and I initially met. When I first started tutoring the ACT and SAT many moons ago, I only covered the verbal sections of the exams, not math. However, after repeatedly being asked to tutor the math sections by parents who were happy with my results on the verbal side, but just couldn't find a suitable math tutor, I finally agreed, and I did tutor math for a time, and it worked out okay, but I was so busy tutoring the verbal and ACT science sections that I was never able to really dig in and do the meta, as the cool kids say, on the math sections, at least not as much as I wanted to. And eventually I got so busy with my true passion, the verbal sections, that I knew I had to stop doing math. But I also knew I had to have an alternative to offer my clients. So I did what everyone does. I turned to the internet. After a thorough search and vetting process, watching dozens upon dozens of ACT and SAT answer explanations on YouTube, I found someone who was clearly an expert in the exams and who I had high confidence would turn out to be a great referral and colleague. That person, of course, was Rob Schombs. I got in touch, and the rest is history. I've been referring him to my clients ever since, and they have always raved about the results. But Rob doesn't just do math. Unlike many ACT and SAT tutors, he truly understands all facets of the exam and, most importantly, knows what it takes to help people increase their scores. And speaking of ways to increase ACT and SAT scores, today Rob and I are going to be discussing the critical role of practice and why it's almost all you need. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you for that amazingly kind introduction. It's been great working with you so far, and there's many more years to come, I hope.
As I do, yes, and well, it's well-deserved. Just a couple weeks ago, I did an episode of the SCORE podcast, provocatively titled, Why Too Much Practice is Hurting Your Score, in which I stressed the critical importance of spending ample time studying strategy and doing quality practice, that is deliberate practice, over sheer quantity of practice. Of course, with a title like that, I probably lost half of my parents, half of the parent audience. Too much practice? No such thing. We're out of here. But so now we're here. The title of this episode could be taken to suggest that practice alone is all you need. Is this a contradiction? I mean, after all, if all students need is practice, what need is there for us tutors, right? Are we arguing ourselves out of a job here?
I think at the end, we will largely find a way to square the circle. I don't think there's that much daylight between what you talked about in that episode and what we'll talk about today. At the end of the day, I think it's just a difference of emphasis and maybe a difference of definition. But I think largely we're going to find some harmony between these ideas. I come at this from the perspective of, it's a little buzzwordy, but the science of learning. Perhaps you've heard of this whole debate, especially in the science of reading in particular, but just a renewed focus where a lot of people are coming at learning from a cognitive science perspective, from a psychological perspective, and maybe attacking some sacred cows that we've all taken for granted for a long time. And so when it comes to that question of, okay, when you're studying for any test, what's the best way to prepare? Do you study strategy? Do you do practice problems, practice tests? I think at the end of the day, I always come at it with whatever you do, you want to make it as active as possible, right? So practice problems, which is what I focus on in practice tests, is one of the most active things you can do because you're engaging with a question, you're engaging with material, requiring you to figure it out as you go. It's not passive in the way that maybe reading a book would be passive, or watching a video would be passive, or listening to a lecture would be passive. So when it comes to learning strategy, there are ways to learn strategy, for example, that are just as active as doing a practice problem. Things like flashcards. Maybe we'll get into this more later, but things like flashcards, things like self-quizzing or self-testing on the strategy specifically. Those sort of active ways. So I don't necessarily think there's a distinction. Like when we talk about this later, we'll talk about the kinds of practice problems, but you can do practice problems that are like SAT questions. You could do problems that are maybe more strategically focused that allow you to study strategy directly, but in a more active way. So at the end of the day, I think I would sort of unite this all under the banner of whatever studying you do, you want to maximize the active studying that you do. That's going to help you engage with the material, whether that's practice problems, practice tests, flashcards, spaced repetition, all these different techniques that are out there. It's that activity that I think is critical.
Yeah, that is a great point. And that is something that has been hammered into, well, was hammered into me when I was still teaching in a classroom by my teaching supervisor, who stressed that the issue, the critical importance of engagement, especially in this day of internet tutoring, because that is one of the drawbacks, at least I've found. You tell me what you think, but one of the drawbacks of internet tutoring is sometimes, because you don't have that physical presence, the disengagement can be an issue. Have you experienced that?
I th- I think there's pluses and minuses, right? I mean, like for example, I've done in-person tutoring for whether in a home or at a library or at other, Starbucks, and I actually stopped that before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, I was already 100% online, but I have that experience in person, and there are distractions in person, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're in a Starbucks or a library, you're around people. The student is thinking, how do I look? Do I look dumb? Am I going to sound dumb? Right? Or if they're at home, maybe they're distracted by something going on in another room. So I don't think in person is totally immune to these sort of distortive effects. But that being said, you are losing at least that immediate physical presence that is important in terms of reading body language. You can look at a camera, you can be listen to the voice tone. You are missing that channel, but I do think you gain a lot from the virtual, which is
Absolutely.
why not just the convenience of the kid can just go to their chair. There's no driving. It's sort of from like a logistic perspective. It is, I think, a better experience. But not to trumpet tech too much because I think that can be overrated. But there are sort of technical interventions and ways of engaging with the student via an online medium that you can't do in person. I teach some group classes sometimes, and there arguably sometimes group classes can be a little bit tougher online, but you can do things like quick polling and other engagement to get sort of the sense of the class experience as well. But obviously, one-on-one, there are ways to engage that are, I think, amplified by the tech. You have to be aware of the downsides, but I think you can balance it out and actually have a overall better experience, even with sort of the physical distance.
Yeah, that absolutely true. All of your resources, and that was one of the things I loved about online tutoring when it finally started taking off, is all of your resources are right there at your fingertips, and you can make available to the student immediately, which you cannot do that one-on-one because you cannot pack your entire library of resources with you and haul them into the student's house.
Yep. At any time, if like for example, I will sometimes tutor, AP classes and such, and so students will bring homework to me. So I'm not completely in charge of that, but the technology allows me to, take screen clippings, put them up on my whiteboard, write on it. In person, shuffling paper, sort of awkward. So, there are always trade-offs, but I found that especially with one-on-one instruction, you don't lose as much in the virtual transition, and you actually gain a great deal as well in terms of maximizing that activity and that
Yeah.
engagement.
Especially if that is what you're deliberately focused on, is
Mm-hmm.
maximizing engagement, right? So okay, so that was a bit of a side. We're already off track, and and we just got started. So get back to the practice issue. Most people equate practice with at least when it comes to test prep, with practice tests, right? Oh yeah, I have to practice. I have to do a practice test. Is there more to practice than just doing practice tests?
Absolutely. So you've probably had this experience, Dave, but many times I'll start working with a student and I'll sort of take their history. Like, what have you done so far for your prep? And they'll say, I've done every practice test that
Oh yeah.
exists. And, maybe this is a student just going into 11th grade where, many students are starting their prep there and they've already done a bunch on their own. And first off, I completely commend that level of effort and diligence. I mean, I'd rather have that than the opposite. But you always have to go back and say, well, what did you actually do with those tests? I think of taking, like, let's just talk about the SAT specifically. Taking a practice digital SAT, it's like taking your temperature, right? So if you feel sick and you take your temperature and it says 102 and you say, I have a temperature. That's not good. And then 10 minutes later, you measure your temperature again and you say, oh, it's 102. Hmm. And then 10 minutes later, you measure it again and it's 102. And all you do is you just take your temperature. You're not doing anything to address the issue. And so a lot of times when students come in having done a lot of work, unfortunately, they've just taken their temperature 40 times and they haven't done the work, the very hard work, admittedly, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later, but the very hard work of learning from that experience. So practice tests are very important, but there's a whole universe beyond that, I think, of activity. And it's about what you get out of the practice test that really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy, right? Taking your temperature. So, okay, let's talk about, instead of practice tests, let's talk about practice questions, right? And what is the difference between practice tests and practice questions? Yeah, let's
Mm-hmm.
just start there.
Sure. So when we talk about practice tests, often we're doing this in the context of an SAT or ACT, where a lot of times the goal is to get a score at the end of it. So you take a practice SAT, you say, oh, okay, I've got a 1350, and that's a 650 math and 700 verbal, or whatever the breakdown is. And so you're taking that test primarily, really, to get a score, to get a sense of where you're at. Again, taking your temperature. Certainly, you can learn something from that test, especially if you review the questions diligently and go through the process of sort of that post brief, that sort of briefing after the fact, working through the test after the fact. But again, there's that whole universe of material, like, for example, single practice questions, worksheets, other resources that can do a lot more for you than just give you a score. And in fact, are probably ill suited to getting you a score. If you want a score, take a real College Board practice test or a real ACT practice test. But that's only a portion of what you should be doing. On top of that, you should be engaging in practice work, for example, practice questions, worksheets, focused problems, focused exercises on those particular areas, often revealed by your practice test performance, that will let you improve. So it's that hyper targeting of those different areas, those different skills that are important. You can do this with real questions, but there's also other ways of engaging in this that's not with real College Board or ACT questions. But yeah, it's just about, I always approach things, whether it's in tutoring or preparation, with what's the goal, what's the purpose of what we're doing. We start there. What's the why? Why are we doing this activity? And I think a lot of times, whether we're doing practice tests or other kinds of practice, we don't really answer that question. We assume, well, if I just repeat this over and over again, it'll work out. Well, maybe not. And this is maybe getting to your point of too much practice can be a bad thing sometimes if you're not properly engaging with it. That's where the overlap happens.
Yeah.
But if you know what your purpose is and you plan for that, you act with that in accordance with that, you'll be in better shape.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the idea of deliberate practice, not just churning and burning, not just mindlessly grinding, but you have a particular skill or a particular question type that you're focused on. And that is the reason for that practice set. Okay, but that, of course, begs the question, and this wasn't necessarily on our list of questions, but um, how do you know? How does a student know? They do a practice test? Okay, they get their score. Now they have to practice certain skills, certain question types, certain strategies. But how do they know which ones? And how do they know where to get the material to practice those?
So this is the thorny question. This is the $1 million question, probably literally, right? In the case of, thinking of scholarships and future earnings, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you do well in college and beyond. This is the thorny question. And I will say there's a little bit of a learning experience for me on this from a tutor perspective, because like I know the importance of that review process, of that diagnostic process. And, I know as when I was a student, maybe I wasn't perfect, but I think I was pretty good at that for one reason or the other, sort of good with that after the fact analysis of my tests and sort of figuring out.
Yeah.
But the more I'm in this business, the more that I work with students, the more I realize is that is not a trivial or easy process by any means.
Yeah.
And we're asking students to learn. And I think that process of diagnostics and analysis and sort of review, that is the learning process itself. And I think sometimes maybe I'm speaking generally us as an industry, we sort of assume students have those skill sets that they don't. And that's no criticism. It's because they're learners. Like
Yeah.
they're the exact people in the situation where they need to grow those skills. That's
Yeah.
not a given. So obviously one resource we're going to always talk about this is having a tutor, a teacher, some sort of guide, a mentor to guide the process, of course, right? That's the purpose of coaching, of tutoring, and all that good stuff, right? That's
Absolutely.
that's why it's there.
Expert feedback.
Exactly. I mean, that's the number one in many ways, right? Because they're going to be able to, they've seen this before. They know the common pitfalls. They know not only sort of how to address those issues, but the resources that can be used to address those issues.
Yep.
But let's say you're on your own. Let's say you're trying to do more of a self-study. And also at the end of the day, you're probably not going to be working with a tutor for ever anyway. And I know in my practice, I'm very keen on making sure students don't become dependent on me, because I'm not going to be there forever. And whether it's this test or they go to college and they hit some difficulties there, they got to work this out, build those skills on their own.
Yep.
But there are plenty of resources as well you can use for self-studying. It really depends on the resource, right? Unfortunately, the College Board with their practice tests are not super helpful, shall we say, with sort of the analysis portion. But depending on the books or the products or the things you're using, they will often break it down for you in different categories, break out, give you different question sets. So I would say it really depends on the product, but it'd be about what is the book giving you, or the video series, or the app, or whatever it might be. How are they breaking it down for you? And I think that would be maybe the criteria I would use if I were self-studying. Does it give me that sort of structure? Does it say, okay, you got these wrong, here's how you should proceed with this topic or that topic? So if you're not going to have an expert, you're going to need some sort of structure, because it's going to be very hard to bootstrap yourself. I mean, generally speaking, that's the point of learning, is figuring out that process.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're starting from scratch, you're trying to reinvent the wheel. And especially if you're pressed for time, like you pointed out, you a certain number of students, maybe the majority of students, don't really have the base skills they need to get that done, at least not within any reasonable amount of time, right? So then I think that's a good point. Find a resource, whether it's online, whether it's a course, whether it's a book, that says, all right, based on these misses, here are the skill sets that you need to work on, and here are some drills that will help you improve on those skill sets. And at least then you have something concrete that you can try. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, okay, try another book that has a little bit of different approach, right? But it's still leading you through that same basic process.
And this, I think, this is the work. This is the work of improvement, of learning. And students, human beings generally, this is hard intellectual labor. And this is why, for example, we go back to the beginning of the conversation. Why do students, test takers, do practice tests after practice tests after practice tests without the review? I mean, like, why, for example, I always try to get my students to say, look, guys, when you do your homework, try to review it yourself first before you come to class, so that, you've done some of that groundwork and we can just focus on the real specific areas for you. Why is that sometimes like pulling teeth? It's because it's the hard work. It's eating your vegetables. It's doing, the hard gym workout, to use those analogies.
Yeah.
But if you focus on that, if you focus on what's hard, that's where the learning happens. And I think this gets to the general theme of what we talked about earlier, of like active versus passive. What's so hard about learning, and a lot of learning science is showing this, is that what feels good and what feels like you're learning is actually generally not learning. When it feels confusing, when it feels hard, when it feels like you're not getting anything out of it, a lot of times that's actually where you're learning. And so if you're a student, you're trying to look for any signal as to like, is this a good experience for me? This is effective. And you're
Right.
going based on, do I feel like I'm learning? That can unfortunately very often lead you astray. Whereas the stuff that really is painful and doesn't feel like you're learning, that's actually where it's effective. So like anything in life, right? Whether you're trying to be successful in business or acting or sports or whatever, it's where the work is. That's where the value is going to come from.
No pain, no gain.
Exactly.
Yeah, to use a tired cliche, but a true one. One of the analogies I like to use is if you really want to improve and I want a 1600, I want a 1550 or above. Okay, so you want to be a pro, in other words, you want to reach professional levels. So if you really want to get an elite score or just make a significant improvement, you can't just go down to the football field and scrimmage with your friends. You can't just go down to the basketball court and play hoops with your buddies for a couple hours. You might see some improvements from that, but if you really are serious about getting better, you have to drill. You have to focus on technique. You have to pull your technique apart and then figure out what specific parts of it are wrong and work on those specific parts only. And that is not fun, as you point out. It is exhausting. It's mentally exhausting.
I always say that if you don't have a 1% intellect, which 99% of us don't, then you need a 1% work ethic, top 1% work ethic, right? That's if you want a top 1% score, right? To put it into context, right? If you're looking for that 1580, right? Or that's probably even too low, too high. But anyway, if you're looking for that really, 1550 plus score, top 1% score, if you're not a top 1% intellect, you need at least top 1% work ethic, which means, not to oversell it too much, but means it's doing the kinds of things we're describing here. And it's really hard because at the end of the day, your ability to do that is in some sense a function of, to use a math term, a function of where you're at, right? So if
Yeah.
your score is at 1100, let's say, sort of by definition, your ability to engage in that process is limited compared to a student who's at a 1500, just by the nature of its activity.
Yep.
And so that's why there is a kind of almost bootstrapping sense to this, where you have to build yourself up over little by little, time by time. And a tutor or a course or a class or a product or an app can help to facilitate that, to catalyze it. But at the end of the day, I always message my students: you're the driver of the car here, right?
Yep.
You can get aid, you can get assistance, but you got to take it the rest of the way.
You have to do the work. No one else can do it for you at the end of the day. Exactly. So we're talking about, there's always the solution of going to the tutor, but even then, as we say, you still have to do the work, but at least you have a great resource, hopefully, right? If you go to Rob, you do. If you go to Walker Prep, you do. Sometimes you don't always, right? But let's talk about test prep materials.
Mm-hmm.
There's a qualitative difference, right? Well, let me just ask you, are all test prep materials, I'm not talking about practice tests here necessarily, but test prep materials, are they pretty much all the same? Because honestly, I think that is a general impression that people tend to have.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever, buy this book, buy that book. I don't think it doesn't really make a difference, does it? So is that true? Are there qualitative differences? And if so, is it possible to identify some of those?
Sure. So always the gold standard for any test prep for SAT, ACT, even AP to some extent, is real material. By real, I mean by the test makers. I mean, if you're going to do
Absolutely.
MCAT or GRE or LSAT, they've all got their own practice test material. Whenever you're looking for a test, start with the first party material. And that's why, again, going back to earlier, if you burn all of that and use all that up in 2 months at the beginning of the process, if you don't use it judiciously and carefully, it's unfortunate because that's one of the most critical resources. So you always start there. You start there with the practice tests, which again are meant to diagnose and to sort of set a path forward, but are not the only thing you do. You've got the practice test, and then depending on the test, so for example, the SAT has released in their question bank a number of additional practice questions for the digital SAT for all the sections. So that would be
Yes,
another
thank you
great
for bringing
resource.
that to my attention.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for,
Yep.
yeah,
It's
that's
not
fantastic.
obvious. Yeah, it's not obvious, but it does exist. Just Google. I think it's like College Board SAT Question Bank. You'll find it. Um, So start there. Start with the first party, we'll call them materials. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, especially with the digital SAT, with the change in the test and just with the way the test works now, there's not as much of that as we might want. So one thing you could do, I'm not sure if you do this with your students, Dave, if they need it, but some of the older SAT tests, there's actually a decent amount of overlap between the paper and pencil test and the
Mm.
new. So I wouldn't use that as like a full practice test for a score, but to extract useful, exemplars or problems from that and do that as practice would be like a second best thing.
Yeah.
Um, for ACT though, like to contrast this, ACT we have what 25 years of tests
Yeah.
thereabouts more,
Yeah. True.
um, 3 per year. So you've got plenty of what are called the TIR test information release tests. So I think on an ACT perspective, you're good. SAT it's a little bit trickier.
Yep.
So that's first party. Then you've got what we'll call third party, right? These are your Princeton Review books, your Kaplan books, your books by a tutor, right? Like
Hmm.
some tutors variously publish their books. And that's where you get into the sort of hit or miss quality issue. The way that I think about it is, again, when you're doing like a big box book, let's say Kaplan Princeton Review,
Yeah.
they're gonna have practice tests in there. You might be able to take them, but I would basically ignore the score you get from them.
Yep.
It's basically irrelevant.
I would agree there.
Use it more for diagnostics if you're going to use it at all. I though I don't have a book myself, but I tend to find that books by tutors or by smaller companies tend to be better because I just generally think, if you look at a big box company and you look at what they offer, they all usually offer prep for like almost every test that exists.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder how good are they at every test when they do 50 compared to a tutor or a small company which does one or two. So I would, if you're going to go third party, look for those sorts of books. I'm not sure if you have any specific recommendations. I could certainly name some, but nonetheless, it's a little bit tougher with that digital SAT because it's new. But tutor, small company books, I would start there. Same thing. There's a lot, especially with the digital SAT. There's a lot of apps now that are being made by smaller companies, by even solo tutors. Practice questions and sort like I would start there. Like that's going to be probably the highest quality than some of the big box materials.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is what is in the books by the tutors or just the materials, the resources from the tutors. Where do those come from? Well, they come from tutoring sessions is where they come from. They come from tutors going, oh my gosh, I need material for my students. So I guess I will, and I need quality material for my students because my students need to get score improvements because my family needs to eat. So let me write some good stuff and then see how it works with my student. Oh, it worked okay, but improvements could be made. Try it again. And eventually you end up with some real quality stuff that the tutor is using in his or her own practice and then thinks to himself or herself, I bet other people might get some value out of this as well. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, why is the College Board and ACT stuff so good? I mean, obviously they're the rulers of the roost there. I mean, it's their
Yeah.
material, but most importantly, it's field tested. Like
Yeah.
they don't have any special magical insight. They just field test the heck out of them, right? They deliver these questions and to all different kinds of students in all different situations. They meticulously track performance. Now, of course, a tutor or a small company can't do it at that level. But what you're pointing to is a tutor is every day when they're using that material with their students is field testing it.
Yep.
Maybe on a more anecdotal, sort of smaller scale
Yeah.
level, but they're getting the feedback and they're saying, okay, this hit, this
Yep.
didn't hit.
Yep.
And they know, okay, my students struggle with this. So I'm going to build items around that point to really highlight it and amplify it. So it comes to that field testedness, actually seeing how students respond to it and then adjusting and adapting. Because I think a good tutor is a good learner, of course. It's probably how they got to the place they are where they are. So a great tutor is also a great learner, and they're going to learn from their students as much as I think, the students are learning from them.
Yeah, so I agree. Let's go ahead and you mentioned that you have some specific resources in mind, and the listeners are going to want to know for sure. Well, first and foremost, Walker Prep, I have heard. I through the grapevine, I've heard Walker Prep has some amazing.
I've heard it's quite good indeed. Yeah.
And then what about you? Do you have material available for the
Sure.
general public?
So we actually used to have video courses for the old SAT. We don't have anything
Yeah.
quite yet. We might develop that. But it kind of depends what you're looking for. I think books, even though it's a digital SAT, if we just focus on the SAT for a minute, I think books are still the tried and true. I I'm a tech is important, but I'm not a booster of it to the sense that I think it's going to solve every problem.
Yeah,
So I'm old fashioned books. I mean, like Erica Meltzer's books for the verbal side are usually pretty well regarded.
absolutely.
Pone the SAT, PWM the SAT for math,
Right.
College Panda for math, the Orange Book for math, 1600.io. These sorts of resources are tend to be well regarded. You also technically have Khan Academy, which I'm not. They're still, I think, a little bit developing what they're doing there, but theoretically they're aligned with the College Board, so that might imply maybe some kind of quality. It's free, which is obviously the big benefit for that, but you can certainly look at Khan Academy. So
Yep.
that would be it from the SAT side. Anything to add there? Is that from your experience cover it?
That I agree with almost all of those. Those are things that I have used, am using now, or have used in the past. Con can be good. Con tends to be a
Mhm.
little on the superficial side, right? They've got
Right.
a mass audience, so they don't always work out really well for somebody who's, oh,
Hmm.
I've got a 640 on or 740 on reading and writing, and I need to get that up to 790.
Yeah.
But just generally speaking, it's solid. And if you're a novice, if this is your first try at the SAT and you're not already scoring super high, yeah, Khan is great, right?
Yeah.
Another book that I use occasionally is For the Love of ACT Science. Any
Hmm.
thoughts on that?
Yep. Yes, that's a great one. Yeah, on the ACT side, that's wonderful. I think maybe on the ACT side, you see a little bit more speciation. In other words, like more books focused on specific sections. I mean, I guess you see that on the SAT as well. But you've got, yeah, For the Love of ACT Science, you've got Erica Meltzer, who's got books on the English and the reading section, sort of the same people on the math side as well, College Panda and so on. Have got their own. So I think you might see a little bit more subject specific stuff there,
Yeah,
especially now with the DSAT, with the test being so much shorter and even like on the grammar side much thinner in terms of what's actually covered compared to
yeah,
previous tests.
yeah,
Even the math, it's about the same content wise, but it's still pretty thin compared to an ACT math, for example, which can run the gamut from middle school math all the way to pre-calculus. And sometimes I think on the ACT, if you find those single subject books, I think that will be a pretty good idea. And then of course there's the applications. There's, especially now with the digital SAT, as I said before, there's this Cambrian explosion of all of these different apps and products. And so I think there we're still kind of evaluating. I'm not so sure there's a clear leader in that category yet, but that's certainly something to be on the lookout for as well.
yeah. And lest we forget Mike Barrett's SAT Black Book,
Yep.
ACT Black Book. Now, I really like those books. I like Mike's stuff, but it is very strategically oriented. He's
Mm-hmm.
not going to give you a lot of tactical advice.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to give you drills. He doesn't. I haven't seen the
Mm-hmm.
black book for the digital SAT yet, but I'm assuming it's like the black book for the paper SAT, in which case it's a very broad view, but I think it's a good broad view,
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking. So that would be if you're looking for general ideas on strategy and you can kind of take a broad idea and work out the application yourself, the Black Book by Mike Barrett is another option. And for those who are listening and maybe in their cars, I will put all of these resources, links to all these resources in the show notes so you can check those out later. Okay, well, we've gone on too long already, so I better wrap it up. But one last question here. When it comes to helping students increase their scores on ACT or SAT math, is subject matter knowledge enough? Why is it that, somebody who knows algebra, who knows geometry, why wouldn't they be a perfectly effective tutor for the SAT or ACT math section?
Sure. So we'll focus on the SAT first, and we can always come back to the ACT, but use SAT as a reference. So, for example, why couldn't a math teacher be a good SAT teacher? And I think they definitely can, especially if they come at it in an appropriate way. It's because I think what throws people off is the SAT math test at first glance looks like a math test you would have done in school. It's got the same squiggly lines, the same pictures, it's got numbers, maybe it's recognized, you could recognize certain things. And for sure, there are a lot, especially now, like the SAT of my day and perhaps your day, you know, was a lot weirder in many ways. And I think over the few couple, decades since, in my case, I think they've brought the SAT math in particular a little bit closer to, what you might call like a common core math. But even still, while there is a number of questions and aspects to that test that is amenable, we'll use an SAT word there, amenable to sort of the standard algorithms you learn in school, the procedures, what I call high school math or math class strategies. A lot of it isn't, because you'll see a question that will look like something you've learned in math class, but it will be worded quite differently. It'll be emphasizing different things. Now, it's testing the same underlying content. So from one perspective, yes, you need to have a very strong basis in the content and what you learn in your math class, because that's what's being tested.
Yeah.
But the way the SAT approaches it, this is true across the test, I'm sure, as you might say, for the reading and writing, but the way the SAT approaches these things can be quite different. And so, for example, many questions, yes, you can use the standard algorithms. Maybe that is the only way to do it, right? What you learned in math class. There's other ways other problems where there is no standard algorithm. You haven't really seen a question like this where okay, I'll do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's my answer. You have to work it out. That's the problem solving aspect of it. There are other questions where the standard algorithm works just fine, but if you know how the SAT works, you can have 1, 2, or 3 other ways to solve it, which are, twice as fast, 3 times as fast, much easier, more effective. So yes, you need that basis. Yes, a teacher who is strong in the base math content can be effective, but we need to add on top of it sort of what are the characteristics of this test? How do they ask the questions? What are they asking you to do? That's quite different in many cases from what you do in your high school math, and you need to be able to adjust and adapt to that. So it is important to have that content, but the sort of strategy or the tactics, the tips and tricks, sometimes as it's called, also do matter.
Yep, absolutely. And same goes for reading and writing, of course. The presentation can be idiosyncratic, and you can't always take it at face value. And as you point out, even if you can, there are often quick ways to get something done that you would not know about unless you were an SAT or ACT tutor or hung out with one. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been incredibly enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot from your expertise. What's the best way for people to reach out to you to find out more?
Absolutely. So we have our website, brilliantprep.com. You can also email me through that website, rob@brilliantprep.com. You can also go to my personal tutoring website, which is rob.school. Yes, it's not .com, it's .school. I thought it was kind of clever, but rob.school, considering my name is SCHO, it kind of fits. But anyway, rob.school if you want to learn more about me. But if you want to learn about our company or our classes or anything like that, brilliantprep.com would be your first stop.
For those of you listening, I highly recommend reaching out to Rob for any of your ACT or SAT tutoring needs. You can learn more about him and his work at rob.school. Thanks again, Rob, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, Dave. Thank you so much.
In this episode of The Score, Rob Schombs and I discussed several resources that can help you get the most out of the time and effort you invest in ACT or SAT practice. You'll find the links to each of those resources in the show notes. But I also strongly encourage you to check out what I think is hands down the very best self-prep system for the digital SAT reading and writing section, and that is the Walker Prep Question Type Inventory. Using the system is easy. Just take an official digital SAT practice test, then go to walkertestprep.com and click on Self-Prep. There, you can look up each question you missed on your official practice test. The inventory will not only tell you the exact question type for each of your misses, it will also provide you with links to the relevant strategy guides and links to targeted practice questions and drills. The Walker Prep self-study system offers the simplest, fastest way to pinpoint your weaknesses and learn powerful strategies for improvement so you can be more confident and score higher on test day. Don't miss this opportunity to achieve your highest potential on digital SAT reading and writing. To start increasing your score today, visit walkertestprep.com and click on Self-Prep. Well, that wraps it up for this week's episode of the Score Podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Until then, keep prepping smarter.